Good morning, everybody. Captain Miles and Jeff Crosby, Captain and Chief Mate of Pride of Baltimore 2, Saturday morning, the 3rd of October, and the coolest morning for the fall so far. We're sub 50, only a little bit, sub 50, and a clear sky with a high pressure overhead. And welcome to Coffee With.
Good morning, everybody, and once again, welcome to Coffee with Captain. What have we been up to the past week, Captain Miles?
Oh, well, you're doing most of the elbow work. You're getting into the galley.
Yeah.
You want to change some of the counter because of some water degradation from the sink, etc. And you're finding that the building of the Pride was almost as strong in the galley as it was in the hull.
Yeah, very much so. Which is really great on one hand.
Kind of take apart.
Yeah, kind of a pain when it comes to figuring out the puzzle piece that is all of the finish work there.
Yeah. And we're planning, again, we continue to be looking at 2021. The kickoff being probably the Maryland Day thing in later part of March down in Annapolis area. So with some coastal cruising as well through the season and the year. Stay diligent, everybody.
Yeah, and keep an eye out for those sailing opportunities. So this morning we're going to talk about the Pride of Baltimore 2's trip to Asia. Captain Miles, can you kind of set the scene a little bit of why was the boat asked to do this, and you know, what was kind of the dynamic around the start and planning of this voyage?
So 1995 going into 96, we were looking at going to Europe and also considering what was going to happen relative to an idea of going to the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a change of executive director at that time. I guess it must have been 93 when that happened. And in 93, with that happening, we were examining, including South America and the West Coast, and turned out that that wasn't such a good idea. You see, there's a lot of business out of South America for the port. That's been changing in the 90s. And so the decision was not to include South America and go to the West Coast. And in that conversation with the change of executive director and all the introductions that goes on, we got approached by the executive director of Maryland Port Administration and say, I want to have the boat visit Asia because we need to increase our relationship for the future with Asia freight by water. So that's when I became aware of the long future thinking that's going on, the business of the Panama Canal getting deeper and wider and two-way capability, which would enable ports that were deep enough to accommodate vessels directly from Asia to the East Coast rather than doing this dropping off on the West Coast and moving it by ground. So I started looking at the feasibility. And one of the other struggles is having the boat be away for more than a year.
Sure.
It's always a challenge getting the word out about the Pride. It's always, whether you're at home, along the East Coast, in the Great Lakes, on the West Coast, and being away and coming back and being away and coming back is a good cycle. But if you do it for you're away for a very long time, it becomes challenging from the public relations point of view. So I scratched all the books that you look at, all the charts that you look at in terms of weather.
Sure.
Not about deep water.
Yeah.
There's plenty of that. It was about, okay, give me an idea where and when, and I'll go to the when factor. The when is modified quite a bit by the threat of tropical cyclones.
Okay.
And the Pacific tropical cyclone season is somewhat different than here in the Atlantic. We have a relatively defined on season and off season, but in the Pacific, it's much more amorphous. it's
Sure.
broader.
Can you kind of explain that a little bit? What is our season versus the Pacific?
Yeah, our season is generally speaking June through September, with a little bit of stuff earlier and after. Um, the 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 Pacific, it's somewhat more. It is a season, but it's not as defined a season. It can be any time of the year. So, looking at also the routing, there was a couple of books. There's a British Admiralty book, Ocean Passages, that talks about pure sailboat, talks about auxiliary sailboat, as well as pure motorboat. And that's an accumulation of information that goes back centuries, because the Royal Navy keeping data, and other commercial vessels keeping data. Then there's this fellow Cornell, who's written much for the cruising world of yachting, cruising, yachting, smaller boat stuff. And he got into a lot of that information and expanded it into the more typical shorter runs that folks would make. So I looked at that, and then also really examined the monsoon season on the Asian coast. Monsoon is their word for just the summer winds going one way, and then the winter winds going the other way. So it ended up as the practical timing was hit China first, and start north, taking the last of the winter winds southbound, with the idea that the transition period would be dealt with, and we'd be going back north again from around Hong Kong back up in the summer monsoon winds. And so with that being the situation, first to Shanghai would be 1st of April. And the routing would be, instead of going around the Galapagos in a big arc towards Hawaii and then across, take advantage of the auxiliary sail factor of the ship and do a motor sail run along Central America, working your way offshore for a bit until you hit the longitude of Acapulco. And then, generally speaking, the trades are happening, and you get to sail the rest of the way to the islands.
And doing that run, not auxiliary, there's just not a lot of wind there, or?
Well, but on the lee side, or the western side of the Central Pacific, is well, first of all, the Central Pacific is pretty much a mountain ridge.
Sure.
And there's an interruption of the flow of the trades. And it takes a while for any real impact of the trades to fill in. So just going straight to Hawaii puts in a lot of fuel. If you curve a little bit up towards, say, the latitude 15, or just below the latitude of Hawaii, you can then reach, under a mixture of sailing and motor sailing, you can reach the longitude of Acapulco, which is, here's an orientation. Panama is the same longitude as here we are in Baltimore.
Okay, yeah.
So to get to Acapulco, you're going 2,500 miles, not so much over the water, but that far west, before you get to the area of the Pacific that's wide open, and you can get the ocean effect of wind and weather. The clockwise circulation of air in the northern hemisphere over the Pacific, that's what's coming in as you hit the trades along the tropical band north of the equator, and there's a mirror one south of the equator, and then you get to go sailing.
Right.
And now all the plans for going to Asia, instead of hurry up and go, we finally had an agreement to do it for 98. So we went ahead and went to the West Coast in 94, went to Europe in 96, and then our usual stuff between the Great Lakes and the East Coast. And then in 98, we took off actually late '97 in December, and we
Ooh.
made the big departure. And
In December, in the winter. How was that?
oh, we've done it. We wound up doing it a number of times in the early days where the boat would go year round.
Sure.
So so the other thing that had to be planned for is you have regulatory factors. So
Mm-hmm.
dry docking in those years was required every year. So we pumped that up so that we could get it done locally in Baltimore. Did that in the fall before we got going. The preparation of crew for and the ship, along with the stops along the way. There was going to be a significant stay in Hawaii to overcome the general wear and tear and get ready for the next wear and tear, because there's going to be 5,000 miles just to get to Shanghai from Hawaii.
So Hawaii was kind of like the halfway point.
Not really, because you've got the 2,000 miles to get down to Panama, and then 5,000 miles to get to Hawaii. So then you get 5,000 miles to go to Shanghai. So
more the 2/3 point.
Yeah. Right. And then one of the things that developed as this mission became very public, and it was a public-private partnership. It was state monies through various agencies, particularly with the leadership of the Maryland Port Administration, but also Pride Inc. finding extra money and with this purpose. This is one of the most significant requests that came from the state.
Mm-hmm.
We've always been drawing the state into, this is a great advantage. Use the vessel in the various places that the vessel is at. This is fairly unique to have them say, this is what we want to do. And it was a big project, so there's a lot of goings-ons at the very high level about how to pay for it, while I was examining how to do it in less than a year. So I've been teased a little bit about, you got halfway around, why did you keep on going?
Yeah.
So the plan was go out and back and do all the ports that we felt were needed, and get back, and we could be back in late November, having left Baltimore relatively early in December the year before. A lot of planning went into that. A lot of, and one of the interesting things is that we know so much about the boat that we can do this kind of planning. We can do 10 years out and know that the plan is still viable, short of little details. Now, of course, with the change of weather overall in the globe, one could argue that point going forward. But
right.
In general, what we know about what we can do with the boat, expect speed and all that sort of stuff, we can make all kinds of hypothetical plans and be confident that if we've done our homework properly,
that we could be pretty close to getting the right numbers.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened in the publication of and the promotion of the campaign was the Department of Education for Maryland said, we want to take advantage of this. We want to join in on this. We want to put a teacher ambassador aboard the ship.
Oh, cool.
Then they could pay for it using the Christa McAuliffe Fellowship funding that comes out of the federal government. Mm-hmm. So every state gets an annual grant under the name of Christa McAuliffe to identify a teacher who's teaching within the public education system, who has a project that they can't really get done by being in a full-time position as a teacher. And if they feel the project is valued enough, they can pay for a substitute. And then the teacher who's stepping out to do the project has to agree to come back to public education for the next 3 years after the project is completed. Mm-hmm. Now, what was unique about Maryland is that instead of getting proposals of projects, they were saying, this is the project. So if you want to do it, you make application.
Interesting.
There were some 21 teachers who raised their hands, and it filtered down, and Pride Inc. was involved with some of the filtering. And so the teacher aboard, as was the moniker, came aboard from the state of Maryland. So that was a big public relations campaign. The idea was to visit schools in Asia, and took a lot of scrapbooks from schools here in Maryland to find partnerships out there. And so we had an emissary on board who was a real ambassador, as against the Pride being the ambassador, the captain just being the crew, just being the crew, right?
Sure, yeah.
So that was sort of an interesting layer that was really good for communication and storytelling. Leslie Bridget was the teacher who won the interview process. Later on, we got married.
Sure.
Quite a while later. But it was a lot of work, equal, if not more so, to the rest of us, because we could just work with the ship in port and say welcome, but Leslie was treated to it. I got on one of the tours in Taiwan. It was interesting to get up into the hinterlands of Taiwan and the high hills. It's pretty hilly there. And one other time in Guangzhou, we got into the country, which is the mainland side opposite of Taiwan. And when you get into the country out of the metropolitan areas you really get into the country right quickly. There's not an awful lot of modern sprawl back in the day. So that's the planning side of it. And the execution side of it, we ran into a significant issue from a sailboat point of view, crossing between Hawaii and Shanghai.
Sure.
It was an El Nino year. Anybody know what an El Nino year is versus a La Nina year? There's no wind.
Yeah.
In the trades, there's very little wind in the trades. What's typically 15 knots is 10 knots. And when you're going downwind, that's in a pretty heavy displacement boat, and you're not carrying the great big spinnaker stuff that we see these days. It's a slow process. While we were in Hawaii, about 3.5 weeks, I got out there early to start getting my head wrapped into the vessel preparation. I interviewed, got a chance to visit NOAA folks in the Weather Service, and asked them what their assessments were. He says, we have no idea. We just know what's going to happen. And then if you're taking temperatures, would you send us the water temperatures?
Yeah, right. So while you're out there, by the way. Sure.
So as you go closer to a point toward the equator from the latitude of 20, where Hawaii is roughly, you usually pick up more wind. So we kept dropping latitude, motor sailing, jibing, setting the stunsail, jibing. It was almost like morning and evening. You did a jibe in the evening, you did a jibe in the morning, and that's where the wind angle changes a little bit because of the sun going up and the sun going down. You get a little bit north of east, a little bit south of east, so you're trying to go west, and so that's how that works out. I started to worry about having enough fuel and making enough speed to not be tardy in Shanghai.
Right.
So I notified the office that we're looking to go to Guam, which is an American island, and we would just stop just for fuel. And a lot of effort on the staff part and other communications. We wound up spending 10 hours. We got fuel, we did the laundry, we got mail that was forwarded to us, which is a great boon.
Yeah.
And then we bought some ice cream.
Yeah. That's a lot of logistics to line up in a short time window. Yeah.
And we were on time for Shanghai, so April Fools was not something we had to explain to the
Right.
Chinese.
Yeah. Just real quick to address a question that I saw earlier, I think from somebody named Roland. Pride of Baltimore 2 is part of Tall Ships or Tall Ships America. So to answer that question. So going back to this trip to Asia, can you just kind of walk us through what the port stops were?
So the formalized port stops for Asia were Shanghai, Xiamen. It's spelt with an X to start with, and it's, like I say, it's the mainland side of the passage between Taiwan and mainland China. Then it's Hong Kong, and then it's Guangzhou, which we know in history as Canton, back in the the British days of creating that commercial port. It's up the river, Pearl River, in the Anglophone reference to it, from near Hong Kong, quite ways in. We had to lower topmasts a bit, and then pump them back up again so we looked right when we were alongside, and then lower them again to come down a lower wire, and then pump them back up again before we go to sea.
Oh, that's a fun exercise.
Oh, yeah, as you know. Make it tighter. How tight do you want this? Make it tighter.
Yeah.
And then we returned to Hong Kong from Guangzhou, Canton, only for logistical reasons ahead of going to Taiwan. We are in the southern end of Taiwan, which is Kaohsiung, northern end of Taiwan, which is Keelung. By the way, anybody who goes to sea a lot and sees big green commercial vessels called Evergreen, that's a Taiwanese based company.
Okay, yeah.
And they visit here in Baltimore all the time. Then it's to the southeastern corner of that squareness that is South Korea, the peninsula of Korea. Tongyong is a port within a province, which I can't remember the name of, that is a sister state province with the state of Maryland.
Oh, okay.
So we went into Tongyong, and what was interesting about Tongyong is the hillsides looks like you're going into as much as of a fjord kind of situation as you see in Maine. And it had all the terrain of Maine, and we got into a pretty significant fishing port. That was very interesting. And then around Busan, which is on the eastern side of Korea, before heading across to Japan and going to the what is generally described as the Middle Sea of Japan. Not the area of water between Japan and Korea. That's a different name altogether. But if you get inside of Korea, there's a nearly landlocked bit of water that you at the western end of the overall Japan area, and that's the Middle Sea of Japan. And went to Osaka, and then Nagoya around a peninsula, and then out of Nagoya into the Tokyo Bay, and there are 3 ports there. There's Yokohama, Kawasaki, and Tokyo, all in a row on the western side of that bay. And then we came out and went across the northern Pacific to Seattle, and then down through, I think we visited Portland. Seems to me we did. I get confused as to where we didn't that year, but had in '94.
Oh, right.
And then, see, we had 2 captains. So Dan Parrott was partner captain and part of this. So I did the trip out to Panama. He picked up in Panama, went to Hawaii. Then he came back to do Korea through Japan, and then I did the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific Crossing, and then he picked up in Seattle and took her down to Panama, and I got back aboard in Panama and did the last leg.
Okay.
And to Baltimore. So so San Francisco, and then San Diego, and then pretty much straight home from there, except through Panama.
Sure.
So,
what was kind of the reaction to people seeing the Pride as you traveled through all of those really wonderful places?
Well, Panama is no particular comment one way or the other.
Sure. I mean, they have boats going through there of all sorts all the time.
In Hawaii, we were welcomed alongside that square rigger that's in Honolulu to lay for the period of time. And we were somewhat disappeared alongside her. So except for those who actually know the Pride was there, there was and there was nothing special about the commerce side of being in Honolulu. It was really a logistical stop. Although the locals treated us very, very nicely. It was a big celebration for the departure, a lot of Asian, Hawaiian traditions. We got to know the canoe people, the Hawaiian canoe folks that were getting ready to do their world passages eventually some years later as they were building and practicing and all that sort of stuff. So that was really cool. Shanghai, that's an interesting story. They were so back in those days, the relationship with the West was very, very sheltered. It was insulated, rather. commercial vessels went to an outer area of Shanghai. And you had to have a passport you surrendered at a gate to go into China, and then you couldn't get back to your ship without coming in and presenting yourself and then picking up your passport to go back to your ship. So their presentation was is the Pride should be out there, along with these great big iron vessels and steel vessels. And we were saying, no, you don't. We want to be visible. We want to be involved. So it took a lot of negotiating to figure that out. It got sorted out. They put a cupola right along the end of the gangway.
Yeah.
You couldn't get off the boat if you didn't have your passport.
Oh, wow.
If somebody lost theirs in the bunk for a day and a half,
Right. Yeah, that's out of luck.
He found it, could go ashore. So but the welcome was really great. But what was interesting is they didn't fathom that we wanted to sail in. You pick up a pilot and do the grandstanding, but they didn't want to see any of that. They just said, no, come straight into the dock. It's a security thing. I understand it.
Sure.
But then they said, wow, how beautiful, this is great. Because right across the river was the architecture of Europe that goes back 100 years, called the Bund.
Yeah.
And then across, they were getting ready to build their new Jules Verne city of skyscrapers, which we see today. There's one at the time, it had this, it's the needle with the big bulb in the middle of it, stood proud. Now it's surrounded by all these other buildings and disappears.
Sure.
At the financial district. But anyhow, they said, why don't you have your sails up?
That's what we wanted to do when we came in. Yeah.
So we were able to put the square sail up while we were at the dock because it wasn't blowing too hard. But then we ran into our first really, really significant logistical headache.
Sure.
It turned into a very expensive one, too. We had learned up in Leningrad, then renamed back to its original name, St. Petersburg, Russia, that we could run a water maker. So we didn't have to try to find local water or deal with local water or buy bottled water. Well, that didn't work in the river at Shanghai. They'd had a lot of rain leading up to, for like 10 days, so there's so much silt in the water that the filters protecting the water maker clogged within about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So we couldn't run that anymore. And we couldn't just take a local water. And so we had to buy bottled water. And we were paying more money per gallon for bottled water than we were for fuel.
Oh, yeah, I'd imagine.
And so, doing showers and other stuff, and it's, as you know, we go through roughly, on average, 100 gallons a day.
Yeah.
And so...
and that's being somewhat conservative.
Yeah,
we can be a little more diligent, but
Yeah.
not too much,
Yeah. The second logistic was again this business of the difference between the West and China was you just can't be from the West and buy fuel.
Sure.
It's a protected resource.
Okay, yeah.
So I knew this ahead of time, so we topped off in Guam, but we still used a fair amount, probably 50%, because of the way the China Sea weather was at the time, getting into Shanghai. So I know we have 700 odd miles to go, and we're going to need some topping up. And so I go to the agent, and this is a Chinese fellow with a young man with really good English. So I knew that he was a pretty spirited mind, and so I played a little trick on him. He came, checked every day, and I waited for the third day to get my head around everything, and then said, so he asked me about, so how are things? I said, it's fine. Oh, by the way, we're going to need to buy some fuel, because of going down the coast. Oh, there's this pause. Captain, we can't sell fuel. I said, I know. And we can't leave without fuel. So there's this little go around. Finally, I said, look, we're happy to stay here as long as you want. But we can't leave without the fuel. For a little while, there was this startled look on his face, and he started to smile. And I think he was pretending to get my joke, but he was actually understanding that I'm sorry, we're a small boat. We
Yeah.
have these realities. And so how do we do it? So he said, this is going to take me a little while. So sure enough, it was almost 2 days for him to figure out how this was going to happen by getting arrangements made by upper level. And what it turned out to be is instead of just the pilot coming aboard for departure, it was a pilot in 2 military uniforms.
Oh, wild.
And then the pilot guided us to the dock we were going to get the fuel from. And with the arrangement, it was going to be cash in US dollars. We get the fuel, we pay the money, the 2 military guys get off, and we're topped up, and the pilot then does the thing that happens when you leave, and we drop the pilot off at the normal place. So it was more interesting to communicate the problem than it was as the solution was a fine solution. But
Right.
It was the communication.
Was a military accompaniment. Yeah.
It was the cultural reality and the difference in terms of back then, just how much sort of equivalency could be done in regular currency or not. And So yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Yeah. How was the reception in like Japan?
Well, in Japan, well, all of the, except for Shanghai, which was the first sort of get to know everybody thing, pretty much all the other ports did a lot of the Chinese traditions for welcoming honored guests.
Okay.
So if anybody's been in China, in an American Chinatown where there's been these firecrackers and these various things, and there's the lion like a dragon kind of thing that gets a long serpentine tail, all this stuff goes on every arrival.
Sure.
So we
A
get
big
in-
kind of festival.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so it was really fun to see all that, and we were able to get it timed in such a way that we could do our grandstand stuff and have sail set and shoot a cannon and get alongside, and then there was ceremony, and the Asians take ceremony very, very seriously. And so we had been prepped to some degree before we left Baltimore with a cultural training for a day. So we were somewhat prepared for that. So the receptions everywhere were because of the ambassador nature, state of Maryland, tourism and transportation and Port of Maryland and that sort of stuff. There was a reason that the locals prepared beyond just the sailboat. And then the adjustment was, this is a sailboat, so that's a celebration as well. And so once they got clicked into, because Leslie, when she wrote logs about the experience, she was able to describe, first of all, to the Americans, what the place was that is like. But in turn, those folks were reading her logs. And they were getting prepared to take her everywhere because they wanted their story told by her to be better than the story she told about
kind
the
of
previous
one-upsmanship.
one. Oh,
Yeah.
It really put a lot of pressure on the teacher aboard to do all kinds of reading and get it and get it written fast enough because of the distance of time between ports. And so
Right.
so there was an awful lot going on. We could send it out by either email from ashore or through the satellite. The words anyway, and some photographs. We had a satellite communicator on board, which is the first time we'd ever had that in that context of any kind of data.
Sure.
And yeah, so that was an interesting dynamic as well. And one of the side stories we have is between Shanghai and Xiamen. We got well ahead of schedule timing wise, and I didn't want to just drift around out there. So I took a look at the data that I had, Coast Pilot, and there's this, and the scale of the charts. You didn't have detailed charts of every little inlet. And there's a lot, again, it's security stuff. So I found a description for larger ships, like 10,000 tonners, where they could shelter from a strong monsoon from either the south or the north in this open bay area of this one island, coastal island. So I set up to go there, and we got there just at dusk, and we were motor sailing, but with the main up. So we needed to round up and take the main in before we. Now darkness had fallen, fog had set in.
Sure, yeah,
And we
all the
couldn't
great things, yeah.
and we couldn't even see the shore. This bay was big enough that we couldn't see the shore. And when we turned around and rounded up, as luck would have it, I hadn't adjusted, the radar was adjusted for a little bit further away, so I didn't realize we were going in an aquaculture farming area.
Oh, great.
And there were these buoys every, I don't know, 30 feet,
Yeah.
maybe 50 feet. And luckily, we could get our way back out of it before we chopped one of them up. And so I retuned the radar, and the main is down now. And the sea's not rough; it's just that it's
dark and foggy
and foggy and stuff. So I could see the aqua farm, and I could see that it was a pattern, much like a grid, like playing a game where everything's a square, a dot. And then there was a gap, and then there was shore, and the inner shore of the bay. So I just motored up along, navigating along the way, and people could start reporting from the bow. We hear surf, crashing waves.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
What's he mean? Thank you.
Yeah.
So we hit the corner, we come in, and we go quite a ways before we actually start to see anything that is land-based. And see a few boats moored up, and these are open boats, either rowboats or maybe motorboats of a colloquial design. And then we see one white light, a yellowish road light way up high. It's hard with the depth perception with that kind of thing to figure that out. And I'm watching the depth finder, looking the radar, assessing from the coast pilot that what the situation was, so it wouldn't be surprised. I felt pretty confident we weren't going to be surprised by anything. So then get to a location, drop the anchor. And the night was spent responding to local interest.
Sure.
So the first was maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours after we dropped the anchor. Very quiet. It was just sublime. The deck watch, because we had an anchor watch, came down and said, "Captain, we've got folks in rowboats all around the boat. They're touching it."
Oh, great.
So I come up on deck, and I'm looking, and after a little while, and we hear this local tongue dialect jibber jabber going on, I realize these folks are really well dressed in a very kind of tweedy way, complete with cap and double breast and vest. And okay, so they're just curious. They're wondering what's going on. They got flashlights, and so that crowd. I go below. I said, "All right, take a look."
Yeah.
So I go below. They disappear. Maybe an hour and a half later, there's another group, or at least it's the same group again, if not another group. Same scenario. I get called. I check it out. Sure, go back down below. And then we hear an engine. About an hour later, we hear an engine, and you can interpret it as an inboard engine of a boat. Okay, now we get the authorities.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So sure enough, a fairly sizable but open boat came up and nosed in against the port main rigging where the channel was, and this young man. There were a couple of uniforms in the boat. Hard to tell what they were.
Sure.
They're just uniforms. I believe they're local police. This young man tries to speak English. Now, we don't have any Chinese on board the boat. And he has more English than we have Chinese. So there's this very difficult ear tuning for me that eventually started to get better in trying to understand the tortured English, as I referred to it. But I finally understood that he has police on board. We were hearing pleats, pleats. So finally, okay, police, all right, okay, come aboard. And took him down below and presented this envelope that was sealed with 4 hieroglyphs on it, stamps on it. And I said, and they pushed it back. So whatever it said, they had no reason to open it. And then they just got into a conversation as best they could to try to understand who we were, why we were, where we were going, how long we thought we would be there. And long story short was, I said, okay, we understand. and you're in tonight, you stay the day, stay the next night, probably go the next day because of your schedule. And okay, we're an aqua farm area. Don't put anything in the water,
Sure.
and don't come ashore. And they went away, and all day long there was this activity going on around us that was their activity. There was a christening of a fishing vessel on a long beach on a trolley that they ran around the beach with flags and
Oh, cool.
and festoons and stuff, and a very small fishing boat. And then there were others that were going out to the aqua farm, and then up high where the one light was, it turned out to be a street light, and it had to have been easy 200 feet up, pretty steep shore, not a cliff, but pretty steep shore. There were these periodic heads that we could see looking over at us. So my sense of it is it was as much a sort of a escape resort island for locals from the mainland as it was a aqua farm and fishing area.
Yeah.
So then we got underway and went on to Xiamen, and it was a pretty cool exercise. But that whole story of them at night in the dark reminded me of the movie 2001, and the apes are over by the... Not because the folks are apes, it's just this curiosity. What is this thing?
Yeah.
And started explaining that we're from Baltimore, from the USA. They could get the USA part, but the Baltimore part they couldn't grasp.
Right.
This is why you're here. We're a sailboat, and the weather's not great, and that took some effort. But they were exceedingly, they were very proper. And so it made our job very easy to match that.
Sure.
Propriety.
But so this begs the question, what was in the envelope?
Yeah, that didn't get shown until we got to Xiamen. And
Okay.
I never knew what the contents were, but in Xiamen we got cleared back in again, assuming that was the process. And there was an agent there to handle it. So you give it to them, you have your crew list, you have this, that, and the other, and bada boom, bada bang, it got done.
But the envelope was the...
But in Shanghai, they gave me the captain, you take this to the next port, and
Sure.
you show this to anybody who asks. Now, they didn't anticipate me stopping. I didn't anticipate
Right.
that. But when I put that out there, they pushed it back.
Yeah, that's a whole secret documents. Okay. Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
What was it like doing the passage back across the Pacific?
It was a wonderful ride. Now,
Yeah.
I did the leg between Hawaii and Shanghai, and that was a lot of work. Dan had done the run between Panama and Hawaii, and that was a fair amount of work. It just wasn't blowing that hard, but they did get some breeze as they got out away from the continent. From Tokyo Bay. Well, first of all, we were so full of grass and mushrooms on the bottom.
That's sure.
So motoring out of Tokyo Bay, no ceremony, motoring out of Tokyo Harbor, no ceremony whatsoever. Leslie was reminding me that, there's this lonely crowd of 20 Anglophones and nobody else, maybe somebody from the official side, like through the services for the Port Administration, local ship's agent. And then we wandered off, whereas, we left Baltimore, it's a big deal. And so I went down the bay, and I sort of suspected what we would have to deal with, and I had been asking around where could we go to do a bottom cleaning while we're in the water, and we got some locals to help us out with that. Sure enough, you pick an RPM, we got half the speed.
Oof.
So we got around to this a little recreational harbor that's at the just outside the mouth of Tokyo Bay over to the east, and we wound up renting 10 bottles and 6 sets of gear, and in one daylight day, with changeover and crew, everybody snorkeled or bottled, and we got the boat clean. And it was easy to come off. It wasn't that hard. It's just the warm water and transitioning and the length
And
of
rivers
the
and
right. So the sail across, we started off with a northerly breeze, and we hit a front that we saw ahead of time coming our way. That then we got on the eastern side of a high pressure system in the Pacific, and there was that lovely ridge formation, and we put her on a starboard tack, all broad reaching. This time with stunsail when the wind wasn't too hard.
Sure.
And we just day after day after day after day. Some of a pretty dense fog. Sometimes the breeze was up in the 20s, and we had to get the Ganfel down oftener and the stunts were already off, and other times we had everything going day after day. Not a lot of motion, not a lot of bouncing around, just going with it. 190, 200 miles a day, quite often.
Oh, nice.
Maybe a little better in a couple of days, and we carried it to almost 300 miles within Shanghai. Seattle, and then we fell out of wind altogether. We motored the rest of the way, but it was a great crossing for that, and a great
a nice
great
way to
circle
decompress.
way around, right? And we had worked out a deal with a weather router where, because we were doing weather reporting for the National Weather Service every 6 hours. They could monitor where we were, and for a lesser price, they would just give us a 3-day update.
Oh, cool.
Unless I asked them for more specific information. And that's what we had done going out to the west. And so when we reinvigorated this again to go from Tokyo to Seattle, when they updated me after the cold front, they suggested Rumline to Seattle. I said, whoa, wait a minute, you guys. Have you forgotten what kind of boat we are?
Yeah.
We need to do this sailing boat machine. And so, never mind. Yeah, here's the update.
Yeah.
To the update. So as a captain, you get into these kinds of weeds, whereas the crew are sort of like,
this is a fun ride. Yeah.
Or it might not be, depending. Between
Sure.
between Taiwan and Korea, we were down to the last thimblefuls of fuel because of the monsoon had not reversed at that one set of days to go up there. And we did a little bit of sailing out of Keelung, but then it was motor sailing, and it was a fight to windward. Not heavy stuff, but just steady 18 to 20. So you just
everything contrary.
And you're running, instead of less than a gallon a mile, you're running upwards of 2 gallons per mile because of the windage and things like that. And I'm beginning to notify that I'm not sure how this is going to work out. And we got in with maybe 50 gallons on board.
Oh yeah, that's getting there.
It was a bit worrisome.
Sure. And I think to end out the story, what was homecoming like, bringing the Pride back into Baltimore after this really awesome trip?
Well, it was a challenge. It was a very warm welcome, but it was a cold front day.
Oh,
now
great.
we go to the trouble of somewhere in the Chesapeake Bay, the Pride is, and she's due in. So we had gotten into Curtis Bay courtesy of a board member who was a member of a company there with a pile driving and dock building situation. So we could go alongside there in Curtis Bay, hiding from the public. And then on the morning of our official arrival, we made our entry, but blowing 20 knots out of northwest.
Oh boy, yeah. So the grandstanding is.
So we didn't set the
these.
square top, so we just went with 4 lowers, and we managed to sail our way mostly in doing that, which is a lot of work for the crew, but it was a completion of the voyage rather than no sails at all and just faking it. We actually sailed quite a bit of the way in on fighting our way against 20 knots of wind. But it was a lovely reception ashore, and we're shooting up the harbor.
Sure.
And and it was a cool day without being freezing, because this is in Black Friday day. That was the day we chose to arrive. Once we got close enough, we could commit to that day.
Right.
And as I recall, that's how it worked out. And then immediately, general public, because we go right to the amphitheater. We went right alongside the amphitheater next to the Constellation. So gangway out, ceremony welcome, and then it's just public for an intense 2, 3, 4 hours. I can't remember how long that was. And then we pulled up away from there. And the water taxi services were really great about accommodating the fact that we used up a little bit of their airspace for docking and stuff. They didn't stop them. It's just they had to sort of take turns and work a narrower band of options. Mm-hmm. And then I guess we went to the Finger Piers right after that, and then started to do our downrig thing. We went through the whole weekend doing some public service. Maybe we went around to Pier 1. I just don't remember the detail. And then the other side of the Constellation. And then at the end of that weekend, it's strip her down,
take it all apart,
eyes, and all that stuff.
Cool. That's a really awesome story.
And I still get teased about why didn't you go all the way around the world? Oh, the other adventurous thing is,
yeah.
is Dan Parrott with the Picton Castle. That was the start of his very first round the world with the Picton Castle.
Oh.
We managed to cross tracks right at Bermuda. Mm-hmm. So we had an official date to be in Bermuda because of the way we plan things out. Mm-hmm. His world cruising is a lot more adjustable. And so it just turned out that we were in this harbor at the same time. We managed, he was in there first, and so he said, yeah, bring the boat alongside. So that's an interesting view. You get the bark, Picton Castle, all braced up sharp, and a little bit of cockbill on the course yards to allow for us to come alongside. We're braced sharp, and we have the leaning back mast. We go alongside. You go ashore in St. George's, and you look back, and it looks like a freaking shipwreck. Masts and yards.
Just everywhere.
Everywhere.
That's everything akimbo.
So they were doing the beginnings of their first round the world Picton Castle round the world, of which have gone to 7 now, and getting ready to do an 8th come next year. God willing, the creek don't rise, pandemic don't rise.
Right.
So that was really cool. The two boats having their two Americans, but 2 different flag boats, because she's Cook Islands and company based in Lunenburg. So that was really a cool thing to start that out that way.
Yeah, that's really awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this episode of Coffee with Captain, and thank you to those that have donated. That really helps us a lot. Those donations keep Coffee with Captain moving along. Feel free to tune in next week. We'll have another episode next Saturday, and also next week there's something that's called the Tall Ships Throwdown, and it's a week-long virtual event that Galveston Historical Society and Tall Ships America have partnered together to host. So definitely check our Facebook page, and I believe there is a website for this event, which the details for that will be posted on our Facebook page throughout the week. So pay attention for those events. There's a bunch of boats participating, so some really cool content to tune into if you find yourself super bored this week. And Captain Miles, do you have any parting words for us?
Stay diligent, everybody.